3 manzanas aproximadamente, lo cual equivalen a 7 veces el Estadio Cuscatlán. También pues, se ha tratado de garantizar que todo el suministro de energía eléctrica, de agua potable, sea totalmente independiente.
March 2022 was a nightmare. Over 80 people killed in one chaotic weekend. Broad daylight turned deadly, and the country hit its breaking point. What followed wasn't just a crackdown, but a political shift that would redefine El Salvador's war on crime. Welcome to El Salvador's Prison War.
Every night, this team from the local morgue heads out to collect the bodies. It's only 9 o'clock and the body count is already...
In 2010, the daily life of thousands of Salvadorans had taken a terrifying turn. Neighborhoods weren't just struggling with crime, they were completely under gang control, extortion, murder, and forced recruitment of teenagers.
This is the war next door. In tiny El Salvador, just over 1,500 miles south of the U.S. border, there's nearly 1 homicide an hour.
El Salvador, a small Central American nation on the world map, was locked in a long, brutal battle against gangs that didn't just roam the streets, but also ruled the nation. It wasn't just neighborhoods they would control, but the prisons. They would terrorize communities and hold the entire country in a chokehold of fear. To really understand how bad it got, you need to know that the violence wasn't random. It was largely driven by a deadly rivalry between 2 of the most feared gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18, and their war would tear through communities, leave families broken and just hollowed out by grief. But here's something that often gets lost in the story. These gang members weren't born killers. Many of them were just young teenagers whose families got displaced during El Salvador's brutal civil war. Kids who never really had a chance. Now hundreds, maybe thousands of these children were left to fend for themselves, some shockingly at a very early age, and some others would be youths, just faced in deep neglect, abandonment, and now they're in a society where violence was normalized. So when the gangs come along offering protection, belonging, and a sense of hope, it feels like it's the only choice, even if it means now that they belong to these people. But here's the twist. Now, this country's gang problem didn't start in their country. To get a full glimpse of how El Salvador got to where it is today, we need to rewind back to the 80s, back to the streets of LA. During El Salvador's civil war, a reasonable number of Salvadoran families fled the violence, seeking safety in the U.S. Now, a very few found some kind of safety, but many of them would end up in these rough neighborhoods around L.A. Many young Salvadoran immigrants were struggling and facing threats, and were being forced to either form or join a gang to survive. This is where MS-13 and Barrio 18 are born. Fast forward to the 90s, the U.S. starts deporting gang members back to Central America. Now, to them, it probably felt like they were solving the gang problem. But what the U.S. didn't realize, or maybe they did, was that they're actually exporting it. These young men were being sent back to El Salvador with some high-level gang tactics straight from the streets of L.A. And now in El Salvador, they're still trying to pick up the pieces after a brutal civil war. So they weren't really ready for what was coming. Now, the reason is that at the time, the prison system was pretty basic, messy, chaotic even, severely underfunded, and totally unequipped to handle the wave of organized violence that was about to crash down on the country. Soon enough, MS-13 and Barrio 18 aren't just gangs anymore. They become ruthless networks, taking over whole neighborhoods, demanding extortion payments from businesses, and imposing their own brutal laws. Local businesses had to pay them to keep their doors open. Families lived in fear of stepping outside after dark. and the government quickly realized that the streets weren't theirs anymore. They now belonged to the gangs. And well, it didn't take long before the chaos spilled into the prisons.
Is it possible to get a tattoo like this if you're not a gang member?
No, you gotta kill.
You gotta kill to get those tattoos.
One of the worst massacres in history happened in 2003 at the San Pedro Sula prison in Honduras, where a fight between MS-13 and 18th Street inmates escalated, killing 68 prisoners and roasting many alive inside locked cells. Investigators said MATA 18 members deliberately trapped rivals during this fire. Now, there's a reason they're infamous.
This signifies the 18th group, the SECOT, and this is the leader of this gang, who was 28 when he died.
In the late 90s and early 2000s, the 18th Street became one of Central America's deadliest groups. These guys carried out mass kidnappings, public dictations, and forced child recruitment, often targeting children, threatening their families where they refused to join. And when they were recruited, they had to do hits, drug runs, and extortion collection. In Guatemala and El Salvador, bus drivers were routinely murdered over extortion disputes. In 2003, MATA 18 began systematically targeting police officers, assassinating them in retaliation for arrests. They would also fuel brutal prison riots, like the deadly 2004 Ampanteos prison massacre. The violence wouldn't be random at all, but strategic, designed to control entire communities through fear and ruthless brutality. In 2016 alone, El Salvador had the third highest femicide rate in the world. 1 in every 5,000 Salvadoran women were murdered, and only 5% of cases led to convictions.
For sure, yeah, 18th Street's like my family. Sometimes even when my parents weren't there, the homies were there. Gotta keep putting in work, representing where you're from, wherever you go.
The 18th Street, also known as MARA 18 or just 18, grows into one of the largest transnational gangs, with an estimated 30 to 50,000 members across US, Mexico, and Central America. They even align themselves with the notorious Mexican Mafia. FBI reports say that branches of the 18th Street gang became highly sophisticated, operating almost like mini cartels. They're identified by their clothing, apparel showing the number 18 or sports teams like the Duke Blue Devils or Los Angeles Clippers. But when you think of how brutal the 18th Street gang was, MS-13 shows up entirely on another level. Known officially as Mara Salvatrucha 13, MS members are often descendants from that guerrilla fighting movement in the Civil War. Most of these guys were poverty-stricken young men, frequently homeless or turned away from their families, trying to survive through small-time petty crimes like drug dealing, theft, and extortion.
In MS-13's case, you'll notice just from the waist up, they'll have tattoos, but he said it's very rare you'll see anything below the waist.
MS-13 members usually cover their bodies and even their faces in tattoos, bearing gang symbols like MS, Salvatrucha, or the devil horns. However, by the early 2000s, the gangsters started moving away from facial tats, making it easier to blend into society now and commit crimes undetected. They would make up hand signs for silent communication. The infamous devil's head, when flipped upside down, forms the M. Fun fact, MS-13 members were recruited by the Sinaloa cartel to help in their bloody war against Los Zetas in Mexico. Now meanwhile, U.S. agencies like the FBI and ICE are scrambling to stop the spread, with massive crackdowns, task forces, and cross-border arrests, all in a desperate effort to stem the tide. But dear God, these gangs only seem to get more violent. From the 1950s, overcrowded chaos in Mariona, to Izalco's failed modern attempts in the 2010s, El Salvador's prisons were always a step behind the gangs.
But the active gang members in MS-13 we meet next door, like Marvin, aren't exactly looking to make amends for their past.
El Salvador had already had a long, chaotic history with its prisons. Let's roll through it era by era. Starting with 1956, La Esperanza. better known as Mariona, which is one of El Salvador's oldest major prisons. Now, at the time, it was a standard setup, built to hold common criminals and the occasional political troublemaker. Nothing fancy until a few decades later, when Mariona becomes infamous for housing thousands of gang members in horrific, overcrowded conditions. A prison that was built for about 1,900 people ended up stuffed with over 10,000 people. Now, at this point, it was less of a prison and more of a human pressure cooker, ready to blow at any minute. Now, just 2 years later, in 1958, Apanteos prison opens its gates in the western city of Santa Ana. Originally, it's supposed to handle low to medium risk prisoners, basic thieves, smugglers, and small-time troublemakers. But as usual, gangs found a way to twist the system, and soon, Apanteos wasn't just another lockup, but a mini kingdom run by gang bosses who built their own internal hierarchies and unofficial governments behind bars.
But you can see that there are dozens of men in a cell. These are their living quarters, the extent of them. Pretty tough conditions, one shower.
Then came Quezaltepeque in 1963. This one was meant to house young offenders and low-risk criminals. But in the early 2000s, during El Salvador's Mano Dura, aka Iron Fist, anti-gang crackdown, the government decided to pack Quezaltepeque with MS-13 members only. Instead of solving problems, it turned the place into a gang fortress, a place where their leaders could now meet, plot, and organize attacks right there from their cells. Let's jump ahead to 1979, the year when Ciudad Barrios opened in the eastern part of the country, and San Francisco Gotera. Ciudad Barrios was initially built for regional criminals, like everyday thieves and hustlers. But by the early 2000s, the system's cracking under the pressure. Prisons were packed beyond capacity, conditions were harsh, and rival gangs could end up getting locked in together, leading to deadly clashes. But even from behind bars, gang leaders continued running operations, giving orders, and fueling violence on the outside. It became clear that locking them up wasn't enough, because they're still calling the shots. Now, by 2004, the government turned it into an MS-13-only prison to keep rival gangs apart. Meanwhile, in reality, they just hand MS-13 a protected HQ to recruit, train, and strategize without competition. For San Francisco Gotera Prison, which was another regional lockup for medium-risk inmates, took a new role. Now it's a rehabilitation center for former gang members who try to leave their life behind by late 2010. Gotera stands out because, in a system drowning in violence, this one's trying to deprogram gangsters rather than just warehouse them. It's a noble idea, but let's be honest, the scale of the gang problem made it almost impossible. Back in 2010, as overcrowding was getting totally out of control, El Salvador opened up Izalco Prison, a modern prison with gang isolation in mind. Now, the idea is for tighter control, better security, and separating rival groups. The timing was pretty awful because post-Mano Dura policies had led to mass arrests, and Izalco overflowed almost immediately.
Aquí no hay espacio ni para ver a las cámaras, porque el régimen penitenciario está cumpliéndose al pie de la letra.
However, in 2010, they started building more prisons and rolling out tougher policies to contain the crisis. One of the most notorious high-security facilities was La Esperanza, near Zacatecoluca, not Mariona. The prison is meant to house some of the country's most dangerous criminals. However, it quickly becomes overcrowded and chaotic, another reflection of the system stretched far too thin. The government scrambles to fix it up, building Izalco Phase 2 by 2013 to try and handle the spillover. But in 2022, the situation was dire. Every major prison in the country was operating at over 300% capacity, with cells designed for 3 prisoners, now holding 15, sometimes 20, all crammed together like cattle. And inside these walls, control wasn't in the hands of the guards. MS-13 had some, Barrio 18 had the others, while most of the guards are just trying not to get killed. By early 2023, the situation officially tips into a full-blown crisis, Over 60,000 people have been arrested in a year, mostly suspected gang members, yet thousands were held without formal charges. El Salvador's prisons weren't just full, they're now bursting at the seams.
In the center of San Salvador, smiles and fancy footwork. But scenes like this were once unimaginable. Deadly violence.
So, when people talk about the rise of El Salvador's mega prisons, it's not just about cracking down hard. This is the result of decades of struggle against gangs, broken systems, and a poor country just trying to reclaim its own streets. Although Bukele needed some space, he more than wanted to send a message.
Sometimes they say that we imprisoned thousands. I like to say that we actually liberated millions. In fact, Mr. President, you have 350 million people.
In 2015, El Salvador recorded more than 6,600 homicides, with over 100 per 100,000 people, making it one of the deadliest countries on Earth. However, by 2022, something incredible happened. That murder rate dropped to just 7.8 per 100,000 people. Oh, it didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen quietly. A man entered the scene. A former mayor turned president in 2019 with one clear promise: to crush the gangs. At first, his approach was relatively soft, launching social programs, reforming the police, and making targeted arrests until March 2022, when the country experienced its bloodiest weekend on record.
Y gracias a Dios, le estamos ganando.
With a highly produced speech to police, President Nayib Bukele celebrating the massive prison's opening, a cornerstone of his war on gangs.
Now, before becoming president, Bukele had made a name for himself in local politics. He first made waves as the mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán, then of El Salvador. He was originally part of the FMLN party, which even encouraged him to run for mayor of San Salvador after his early success. But that relationship soured later on. As Bukele's popularity soared, the FMLN would try to drag him down, linking him to their shady history. Rather than getting dragged, Bukele cuts ties completely and launches his own political party, a bold move that ultimately paved his way to the presidency.
You can ask the people, the woman at her home, the one selling tortillas, the one selling pupusas. Ask them what they think of El Salvador, what they think of this government, what they think of this so-called...
On June 1st, 2019, Bukele was sworn in as El Salvador's 43rd president, making him the youngest head of state in Latin America. Now, for many people, this guy symbolized a fresh start, a break from the corruption and dysfunction that had plagued the poor country for decades. One of Bukele's first moves against these gangs was a controversial one. According to the report by El Faro, a respected Salvadoran newspaper, Bukele's government had negotiated secretly with gang leaders for lower murder rates. And Bukele didn't take it lightly when that news got out. Within days, he launches an investigation into El Faro for alleged money laundering. And since then, his relationship with the press, especially El Faro, is very hostile. He's waging an ongoing war against that paper, often targeting journalists by name. Some reporters have been forced into exile, while others are just leaving the country after publishing sensitive stories, waiting for threats to die down before coming back. Even though El Faro has strong international credibility, within El Salvador, Bukele's campaign is working as a lot of people are now seeing the outlet as biased and unreliable. And he didn't even get started yet. Under his influence, the National Assembly passed a controversial law, making it a crime punishable by at least 10 years in prison for any journalist that reports anything that could have been seen as promoting gangs or causing public panic. That's a bold move, aimed at silencing critics, because Bukele here has much bigger plans, and he's not about to let bad press slow him down. For someone who was born during El Salvador's brutal civil war and didn't hold any interest in academia, Bukele's path was anything but typical. He ended up managing a nightclub, Pretty unconventional start for president soon-to-be. Eventually, he worked for his father and then took over their PR firm, one that had built a strong reputation with one of its biggest clients.
But in our case, all of the arrests are made to end the bloodshed that we lived for decades, and we have ended it.
The Farabundo Marti National Liberation Front, or FMLN, the same group that once fought that bloody war against El Salvador's military-backed government. Then came March 2022, when everything exploded. In just 3 days, MS-13 had unleashed a wave of terror on ordinary poor civilians, killing about 87 people and just leaving the bodies scattered along the road to Surf City. Bukele's prized beachfront project meant to attract international tourists. Again, this wasn't random chaos, but a deliberate, open challenge aimed straight at Bukele's administration. So, you can imagine, it forced Bukele to act fast.
This is the video the president of El Salvador wants people to see, his prison guards manhandling inmates.
Immediately, Bukele declares a nationwide state of emergency, suspending constitutional rights, arrest warrants, and by the next morning, military trucks are all over neighborhoods, soldiers kicking down doors while thousands of suspects are being detained.
Telemundo cameras are given rare access to Latin America's largest prison. Inside this mega prison, you'll find some of El Salvador's...
At this point, it wouldn't just be a crackdown. El Salvador had openly declared war on the gangs. The mass arrest that followed pushed the country's incarceration rate to the highest in the world, with a staggering 1% of its population locked up in a matter of months. And shockingly, the effects were immediate.
A big part of Bukele's appeal is his use of social media to rebrand El Salvador in the eyes of the world. Hosts international events like
the 72nd Miss Universe competition!
Neighborhoods that were once held hostage by gangs are now able to breathe again. You have small businesses reopening. Daily life, at least on the surface, seemed to be coming back to normal. Yet the pressure kept building. But this time under the prison system because tens of thousands of new detainees are flooding in. Social media activity, photos and tattoos and slang are becoming enough to land anyone behind bars in El Salvador. Meanwhile, new laws ensure that gang-related charges carry the harshest penalties possible, with no chance of house arrest or early release. And still, Bukele wasn't done. He reveals the centerpiece of his war on drugs, an extremely large, high-security fortress buried deep within a remote area, built specifically to hold the country's most dangerous criminals. This is not your ordinary prison. It's a symbol.
Empezamos a vencer nuestro más grande mal. Y estamos a punto.
As Bukele himself put it,
"We are at war against the gangs. We will not stop until the last terrorist is behind bars."
And that chilling declaration defines the new El Salvador that Bukele is building, where safety has returned to the streets, but at a steep, undeniable cost of freedom. On February 2023, President Nayib Bukele unveiled one of the boldest statements of his presidency, a max-security mega-prison known as SECOT, which is the physical embodiment of his hardline war on gangs, an iron fist strategy that rejects rehabilitation in favor of dominance and control. Now, for someone leading a country that had endured 2 brutal civil wars and lost a third of its population to violence or displacement, Bukele makes it clear that he's about reclaiming El Salvador. The shift begins in May 2021, almost overnight, when Bukele's allies in the Legislative Assembly removed the Constitutional Court judges, Attorney General, and then replaced them with loyalists. With judicial independence weakened, now we can push forward with policies that would have stalled in court.
It has room for 40,000 people, and it's almost full. prison authorities told us. 80 to 100 prisoners in each cell.
As El Salvador's legal landscape transformed, due process eroded. People suspected of gang affiliations could now be detained indefinitely without any formal charges, no lawyer, no hearing, and the definition of gang involvement was pretty vague, just as the punishments were severe. Simply having a certain tattoo or even associating with known gang members could mean 45 years behind bars. Now, the purge wouldn't stop with top judges. Bukele pushed out dozens more, mostly judges over 60, who were critics of his tactics. He called it an anti-corruption campaign. Lawyers weren't spared either. Many defense attorneys were denied access to their clients, especially during the early months of the state of exception. In thousands of cases, court hearings disappeared entirely. Detention without trial became the norm.
She's heard nothing further about him since he was arrested under emergency powers brought in March 2022 by President Bukele.
At the same time, Bukele is now shifting the country's security dynamics on the ground. The police weren't enough anymore, so he brings in the military, expanding its role far beyond traditional defense. Soldiers start patrolling urban neighborhoods in full gear, helmets, rifles, masks, and communities are sealed off under military watch.
There's another corridor with more security personnel. Luz 24 horas. 24/7 light.
Bukele had heavily invested in his troops, and as new barracks are being constructed, so did their training intensify. Surveillance technology and weapons were upgraded, and in some cities it felt less like policing and more like occupation maybe. So while military boots are hitting the streets, Bukele's waging another war, but this time online. Social media became one of his sharpest tools. His government flooded platforms with high-impact visuals carefully crafted to show strength, control, and progress. He already silenced the press and made laws that illegalize anything that could be interpreted as gang propaganda or causing public fear. For many Salvadorans, after years of fear and violence, man, this iron fist felt like relief. Still, that relief came at a price. The legal safeguards that protect innocent people were swept aside. Freedom of expression was curtailed. Critics, whether they be judges, journalists, or lawyers, were marginalized or removed. Bukele didn't just build a prison, he's building an entire system, trying to ensure that no one's going to challenge his vision.
Hundreds of inmates, barefoot and stripped down to white shorts, scurry into El Salvador's new mega prison, ordered to crouch down on the ground one after another.
This is a rare look inside El Salvador's terrorism confinement center, known as SECOT.
March 11th, 2023, El Salvador released its video that instantly went viral of shirtless men sitting quietly on a concrete floor, all chained together and surrounded by armed soldiers. Then a drone shot pulls back showing how massive this place really is. CECOT, Centro de Confinamiento del Terrorismo. And this is not your ordinary prison, but a centerpiece to President Nayib Bukele's war on gangs.
It's called the Terrorism Confinement Center, or SECOT. It's the centerpiece of Salvador.
Officials on board with us were stopped a mile out. Oh, okay. He's gonna inspect bags now, too.
Located in a remote area far from the public eye, SECOT was purpose-built to house up to 40,000 inmates, making it one of the largest and most extreme high-security prisons in the world. Rehabilitation's not part of the plan here. Comfort isn't even a whisper. Bukele doesn't want to contain El Salvador's most violent criminals. He wants to control and break them.
We've gathered information about the site. There are 8 cell blocks monitored by 19 watchtowers.
From the outside, you might see it like some kind of dystopian movie. The place is surrounded by 23-foot concrete walls, layered with 15,000 volts of electric fencing, and guarded by 19 towering watchtowers. Inside, we have 32 cells per block, each packed with up to 100 men. And get this, only 2 toilets and 2 sinks per cell. Yeah, that's not a typo. Each room is designed for maximum overcrowding and minimum dignity. No privacy, no windows, no fresh air. Inmates sleep shoulder to shoulder on metal bunks without mattresses, bathed in fluorescent lights controlled by guards, and they don't get to turn those lights off ever.
Bukele has said the prison cost $115 million to develop.
The inmates are locked in their cells for 23.5 hours a day. And the half an hour that they do get is tightly controlled, marching on a concrete yard. No sky, no grass, no sun. Just 4 blank walls. And that walk is done barefoot, shackled, heads down, and in total silence.
El Salvador claims it is Latin America's biggest, with capacity for 40,000 inmates. It stretches across 57 acres.
You have over 1,000 people that are guards, police, and soldiers keeping this place locked down. Inmates are grouped into sectors, and they never leave. Everything happens inside. Each cell packs in 80 men, and when one steps out of line, it's off to pitch-black solitary confinement for up to 15 days.
All right, we're gonna go in here.
Even as I'm stepping through these doors, I don't fully grasp what we're about to walk into.
Every corner of SECOT is wired for surveillance. There are thousands of cameras, all connected to a central command room, complete with facial recognition software and AI tracking.
Rayos X, y podemos garantizar acá que todas las personas que van a ser trasladadas acá, todos esos terroristas.
Pero aquí hay incluso dentro del organismo, se ven los pulmones, los huesos.
Before entering, prisoners go through full-body X-ray scans. Even the guards are scanned going in and out.
People have then spent months, years in prison without trial. How many people are in prison without being sentenced? I asked the director.
When trials or hearings do happen, they're often conducted remotely via video conferencing platforms like Zoom, rather than in person. These Zoom sessions usually happen inside the prison itself, especially within SECOT.
Ponga un pie, entre y esté en este centro de confinamiento, vamos a tener una vigilancia 24 horas al día, 7 días a la semana y 365 días.
Inmates stay in a room under heavy surveillance while communicating with judges and lawyers through a screen.
There's no mattresses, there's no sheets. You've got a toilet over here for them to go to the bathroom. You've got this basin here that they use to bathe themselves. And then you can see there's a barrel of water.
Privacy doesn't exist. That's the point. They watch how they sleep, move, and even notice how they breathe.
They give you the 3 times of food. They give you some programs. You go to do exercise.
Food is delivered through a slit on the door. There's no dining hall, no recreation, no phone calls, no visitors. Prisoners don't have access to lawyers, unless the state allows you, and only a few get that chance. Even the gang tattoos, symbols of power and identity, are erased. Some inmates are forced to remove them via laser, while others have them covered or destroyed by force. The goal is to break their sense of identity, making them no longer gang members. And it's working, at least from Bukele's perspective. Communication between imprisoned gang leaders and their foot soldiers on the outside has dropped. There's no room for smuggled phones or contraband secret messages. For the first time in decades, El Salvador's most violent organizations have lost the ability to coordinate attacks, extort poor families, or even run any kind of criminal operation from behind bars. SECOT is more than a prison. This is a fortress designed to disconnect and deconstruct. But here's where it gets darker. SECOT doesn't just test the limits of incarceration. SECOT likes to test the moral and legal boundaries of state power. It's the ultimate expression of Bukele's zero-tolerance policy. Whether it brings lasting peace or breeds future chaos remains to be seen.
The U.S. has sent hundreds of mostly Venezuelan migrants to be held without trial at this mega prison in El Salvador.
In March 2025, the U.S. deports more than 200 Venezuelan migrants to El Salvador, accusing them of being members of Tren de Aragua. What made headlines wouldn't be the number, but the way it was done. These individuals were shipped off to SECOT without formal trials or convictions, no courts, no defense, just accusations and chains. Well, that move instantly reignited a fierce debate over due process and human rights. Critics of the prison system say this is a dangerous path. They argue that when a government begins locking people up without trials, even if they're accused of terrible crimes, it's risky. Human rights organizations aren't thrilled either. You have Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch describing the prison's conditions as inhumane, raising alarms about a number of concerns.
This is not justice. This is a massive prison system built on fear and authoritarianism.
Even the UN has repeatedly criticized El Salvador's ongoing state of emergency, which has been extended more than 20 times. Yeah, but you know what? In El Salvador, people are cheering, man. For many Salvadorans, Bukele is a hero. And you know what? Maybe that's all that matters. You gotta think about this. After decades of fear, which many people can't even imagine, communities are now breathing a little easier. Many people here see SECOT as a necessary step to restore peace. Gang-related murders have plummeted. In fact, his approval rating still hovers around 85%. How many people can you say that for? Let's be real, El Salvador's crackdown has made Bukele a political rock star. His TikTok videos are crazy going viral. His security policies are admired by leaders across Latin America and beyond. You have Honduras and Ecuador now signaling interest in replicating Bukele's model. And even politicians in the US have pointed to El Salvador's plummeting crime rate as proof that tough love works.
They were worried about the human rights of the killers, which, you know, they have human rights. I don't say they don't, they're humans. But if you have to prioritize.
With all that approval, some critics still believe that what happened in the early 2000s, when the US made a similar mistake in building high-security prisons in Iraq that ended up becoming a breeding ground for radicalization where ISIS was born, inside the very prisons meant to contain them, could possibly happen again.